Okay, good morning. The way this is going to work is this is just going to be a set of notes, just like we would do in class. And you're going to hear me talking over them as I advance the slides. So you're going to need your notebook out to be able to take notes, just like you would in class. If you saw in the instructions at the end of this, you're going to need to actually take a picture of your notes and send them in as part of the assignment. So here we go. This is the slide that we left off on in class on the idea of secession. And so what we see here is the number of states and the order in which they seceded from the Union. So we see down here the Deep South, you have South Carolina leaving first, all the way going across with Texas. You have some of the border states here in the middle. We talked about Fort Sumter being the first battle of the Civil War, and so these sort of orange states here are the states that left after Fort Sumter. And if we look at states like Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, these were states that were actually slave states, but they stayed with the Union. They remained with the United States. So these border states, as we'll see today, are going to play a very important role. So as the war gets started, there are some clear differences for both sides, the North versus the South, or what I'll try to use going forward is Union versus Confederacy, because as we know, states like Missouri aren't really in the North. So those Union and Confederacy are better words to use. So let's talk about the North first. Some of this should be somewhat of a review for us of what we know about the North. They had a larger population. They just had a sheer higher number of people. We know based on the Industrial Revolution, they had more trains and could transport and communicate goods and information faster. That kind of repeats itself. We know that they were more industrialized. They had more factories, but they also had some disadvantages. As we're going to see, the North underestimated how big of a war and how long this war was going to take. Most people thought this would just be over in a couple of months. So the North's military was not very prepared. As we'll also see through the first half of the war, first couple years, the Union goes through a number of different generals. And so they failed to get uh, really quality leadership, especially for the first part of the war. Now we'll talk about the South. So if you can recognize a picture of that guy right there, that's Robert E. Lee, now the iconic general of the South. And that was one of the South's advantages is that they had better leadership. As we'll see, Lee kind of gains his reputation from throughout the war, kind of pulling off these underdog victories again and again. He kind of epitomizes the stronger generals of the South, but um, there were other generals in addition to Lee that were also good. So thinking about how the South needs to win, one advantage for them is all they have to do is play defense. This is where I said the map comes into play. So for Lincoln and the North to have an advantage here and to win the war, they actually have to invade the South and force them back into the Union. For the South to win, they just have to keep the North out, or at least for as long as they can until the Union troops quit. So in that sense, they have an advantage. They just have to play defense. But the South also has some disadvantages. Because they were less industrialized, they had a much weaker economy. As we'll see by the end of the war, inflation skyrocketed in the South. What you see there is a um, Southern currency there. All right. So I'm going to move on past this. This is just a link with some different um, information about North versus South. So as the war breaks out, this should be kind of familiar to us. This is just a layout of what was the Union and what was the Confederacy. So we realized that most northern states remained in the Union in the United States, and as well, a few border states that were slave states also remain in the Union, like Missouri, Kentucky. West Virginia breaks off, Maryland. There are a few border states that actually joined the Confederacy, though, like Arkansas, Tennessee. Virginia is probably the most notable. So here's where we talk a little bit about the battles. Now, in class and on this notes, I'm not going to talk too much about individual battles. This is more to just see sort of some concepts that were happening here. When we get to our Civil War research and you're into battles, the idea is that you can choose that for yourself and research that yourself. But I'm just going to stick on big picture ideas here. So if you look at this map, this shows you some of the battles in the first 2 years of the war, from 1861 to 1862. And so what we'll normally see is the Union represented in blue and the Confederacy represented in red. And so you can see sort of two main theaters of battle. You see one out here to the west, all along the Mississippi River. And so one of the goals of the North, as you see in blue here, was to squeeze the Southern economy, to put it one way. They actually call this the Anaconda Plan. So if you see this blue line all the way around the border, the idea was that the North would use their stronger navy to kind of blockade all of these southern ports so that no more goods could get in or out of the South. And that way, they would basically run out of goods and their economy would suffer. And so one way they wanted to do this was they wanted to take over the Mississippi River. So you can see some of these battles, the North trying to make their way up and down the Mississippi River. So a lot of battles are happening there. And then the main theater of battle early in the war and really throughout most of the war is up here in Virginia and Maryland. So if you have to look very closely, here is Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States. You don't have to go very far south to a place called Richmond, and this is the capital of the Confederacy. The two capitals of the United States and the Confederate States were really not that far apart, and so you can kind of guess that a lot of the battles are going to take place between the two capitals. So still to this day, there are a lot of Civil War battlefields in the Virginia area. But what you see happening here is you see several battles. The very first battle was known as the Battle of Bull Run. There was actually a second Battle of Bull Run. But if you notice, one concept is that the South is not being driven back into Richmond. That the North attempts to try that with a general called McClellan, who you see right here. But long story short, the South, under the command of Lee, is able to pull off some underdog victories, and if you notice, actually make it all the way up into Maryland in September of 1862, about a year into the war. So by that time, the war is taking a lot longer than anybody expected. Lee and the South are much more formidable than the North expected them to be, and they've actually even made it up into Maryland. By the way, the Confederates lost that battle and were driven back into the South. But long story short, for the first 2 years of the war, it's taking a lot longer than anybody expected, and the South is doing much better than anyone had expected. So, like I said, I'm going to stay on big picture type ideas here. So, for the first couple years of the war, if you were to ask a Union soldier why they were fighting, they definitely would have said that they were fighting to preserve the Union, to keep the United States together, basically. That's what Lincoln's inaugural address was all about. It was all about the Constitution and keeping this country together and whether or not states could leave or not. A Southerner might just say the opposite and say, I'm fighting because Lincoln sent an army into my state, and I think my state should be able to do whatever it wants. So it's on this question of what are we as a country that we've been talking about. Are we one united people that should stay together, or are we states that can do what they want and come and go as they please? That made up the purpose of the war. But Lincoln, as president in the first couple years of the war, realizes that one of the underlying themes and causes of the war at the end of the day really was slavery. And he sees the war as a chance to end slavery. So he's going to do something at the end of 1862, about a year into the war, that's going to change the purpose of the war. He's going to issue what's known as the Emancipation Proclamation. And it's a little more complicated than most people realize. What he decides to do at the end of 1862 is issue this document as president. And what it did is it freed slaves only in rebel territory, basically states that had seceded. For example, Missouri was a slave state, but it had not seceded. So no slaves in Missouri were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. It also went a step further and allowed free blacks in the North to serve in the Union Army. This was pretty radical at the time. A lot of white Northerners were against this. But Lincoln saw both of these pieces of the Emancipation Proclamation not just as the right thing to do, but also it was militarily going to help the North win the war. Because what the North could now do is they could come down to the South and say that slaves are freed, and that slaves would actually start rallying to Northern troops once they made it into Southern territory. Lincoln also had to be strategic about when he issued this proclamation because he did this on his own. This was a military power of the president, and Congress had no role in this at all. He waited until after the Battle of Antietam, which was a victory for the Union, because he knew if he issued this in a time when the Union was weak, it would not be received very well, and the country might not go along with it. So this is a map just showing you how the Emancipation Proclamation plays out. So you see mostly where it affected was the Deep South, these southern states that had rebelled, most of Virginia. West Virginia wasn't involved, obviously. But if you look at the states that were omitted, that it didn't apply to, were the northern states that had slaves, like Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland. So this was a very strategic move. The other thing that makes it controversial is that since it was a military decision by the president, when the war is eventually over, the Emancipation Proclamation will probably no longer exist. It's only a military measure by the president to help win the war. And Lincoln realizes this, that likely this is only a temporary thing, the Emancipation Proclamation. But what it does most importantly is it changes the meaning of the war from a war about keeping the country together to now the North is fighting to protect, rather, to get rid of slavery because of this Emancipation Proclamation. So it changes the meaning of the war from about union to about slavery. So the war continues into 1863, and you see another set of battles here, and I'll make this brief. So by the second half of the war, 1863 to 1865, you see the North eventually takes control of the entire Mississippi River. And I want to key you into one thing happening over here. Is by July of 1863, July 1st through 3rd, just before the 4th of July, Lee makes it all the way up into Pennsylvania, way north of even Washington, D.C. And this is the most pivotal battle of the war, the Battle of Gettysburg. It's a 3-day battle, eventually won by the Union. We can talk more about this in class, but it is seen as the turning point battle of the war, a massive Union victory at Gettysburg. That was in the summer of 1863, but what I'm concerned about is what happens a few months later in November of 1863. This is a picture of what's known as the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln comes to the battle site a few months after this Union victory, and he's coming to dedicate a new cemetery that has soldiers buried in it. You can see Lincoln, he gives a speech, and this is him sitting down right after he gives the speech at Gettysburg. You can see it's in the winter, the leaves are off the trees. So what your assignment is after this is to read the Gettysburg Address. Lucky for you, it's a very short address. And the reason it's so important is because in the middle of the war, Lincoln basically sums up everything the Union is fighting for. And it sums up these themes that we've been talking about in American history from the very beginning, from the Revolution. Don't worry about that slide. So your assignment after this, now that we have some background, is to look at the Gettysburg Address on Google Classroom, and there are a few questions that go along with it after you read it.